The calm before the storm. Jerome Williams, 29, had always prided himself on being an ordinary man living an extraordinary life, ordinary in the sense that he had always been the type to follow the rules and respect the law. Born in the rougher sections of Chicago, Jerome had witnessed enough hardship and violence to know that getting involved in trouble was not an option if he wanted to create a life for himself. He was raised by his parents, who had their own struggles but still managed to provide him with love, discipline, and a strong sense of right and wrong. His father, a hard-working mechanic, had taught him how to fix a car before he could even drive one. He understood the value of a job well done and how it was a matter of pride to finish what you started. His mother, a schoolteacher, had nurtured his love for learning, constantly pushing him to be the best version of himself, not just in school but as a person. Together, they ensured Jerome never lacked for guidance, and it showed in his work ethic and determination to succeed. Even in his teenage years, Jerome had a reputation among his friends and family for his level-headedness. He was the guy who would step in and break up a fight before it escalated or who would go out of his way to help someone struggling. People knew they could count on Jerome. His motto was simple: do the right thing, even when no one is looking. He was a rising star at the insurance firm he worked for, having climbed the corporate ladder through sheer hard work. While many of his colleagues had chosen to play the political game, Jerome stuck to what he knew best, doing his job to the highest standard, without shortcuts. He had built a reputation as someone reliable and trustworthy, qualities that were increasingly rare in a world filled with self-interest. But while his professional life was flourishing, his personal life had become a bit more challenging. As a young professional, Jerome found himself working long hours, and the demands of his job often meant he had little time for anything else. Dating was a distant thought, friendships, even the closest ones, had grown sparse. However, he didn't mind the solitude. He told himself it was temporary. Once he earned his place and paid his dues, things would calm down. He just had to keep his head down and keep moving forward. On that particular morning, nothing about his routine suggested that anything would disrupt his well-ordered life. Jerome woke up to the sound of his alarm at 7 a.m., grabbed a quick shower, and slipped into his usual work attire, a dark blue suit, crisp white shirt, and a slim tie. His apartment in downtown Chicago, although modest, was tidy, and the morning light streaming through the windows gave the room a warm, almost serene atmosphere. As he made his way out the door, Jerome thought briefly about the coffee he'd pick up on his way to the office. It was a small but comforting ritual. A moment of quiet before the chaos of the workday began. He was already thinking about his deadlines and what he had to accomplish that day, but for a brief moment, everything felt normal. He hadn't even reached his car when his phone buzzed with a message from his colleague, Terry. It was a quick note reminding him of the 10 a.m. meeting with a new client. Jerome quickly typed back a thumbs-up emoji, knowing that he'd be prepared. It was just another day. But that would change, quickly and without warning. Jerome slid into his car, adjusting the seat before starting the engine. His neighborhood was quiet at this time of the morning, and he began the familiar drive to work. The city was waking up around him, the streets slowly filling with commuters. He admired the peaceful flow of the morning traffic, thinking of the weekend ahead. He had plans to visit his parents, who still lived in the same modest house on the outskirts of the city. A trip home was always refreshing for him. His parents, no matter how tough the world became, always reminded him of the importance of family and humility. But that peace wouldn't last long. As he merged onto the highway, everything happened in an instant. His mind was still preoccupied with his meeting when he noticed the sirens flashing behind him. His first thought was that he'd been speeding, but as he glanced at the rearview mirror, he saw not one, but two police cars trailing him. A strange chill ran through him. He hadn't done anything wrong, so what could this be about? He had just enough time to pull over when the officers were already out of their vehicles, rushing to his door. Before he could even open his mouth to ask what was going on, one of them yanked open the door and ordered him out of the car. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Williams," the officer said sharply, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his waist. "You're under arrest for the murder of Evan Richards." Jerome's mind went blank. Murder? The words barely registered. He looked at the officer in disbelief, still trying to process what was happening. "I didn't," Jerome started, but the officer interrupted. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the officer snapped. "Put your hands behind your back." In a daze, Jerome complied. His breath quickened as the reality of the situation began to settle in. Murder? He had never heard of anyone named Evan Richards before, let alone been involved in any kind of crime. But the officer didn't listen to his protests. They slapped the handcuffs on his wrists and shoved him into the back of the squad car. The ride to the station was silent, except for the hum of the tires on the pavement and the occasional passing siren. By the time he was processed at the station, Jerome could barely think straight. The interrogation room felt cold, sterile, and suffocating. Questions were fired at him, but all he could do was repeat the same thing: "I didn't do it. I don't even know who this person is." But no one seemed to care. They were relentless, and the longer they questioned him, the more Jerome felt like his words fell on deaf ears. After hours of interrogation, he was led into a holding cell, and for the first time that day, he felt truly alone. His mind raced, trying to figure out how this could be happening. What did they think he had done? Who was this Evan Richards, and why was his name suddenly attached to Jerome's life in such a catastrophic way? The questions whirled around in his head, but there were no answers, only confusion and fear. His thoughts were interrupted when a guard appeared and told him that he would be going before the judge. Jerome's stomach dropped. A judge? So soon? His only thought now was that he had to clear his name. There was no way he could be guilty. He just needed the right opportunity to explain himself. But as he was led into the courtroom, his heart sank further. Judge Gregory Harrell, a towering figure known for his stern demeanor and harsh rulings, was already sitting at the bench, his gavel poised in his hand. Jerome's eyes locked with the judge's, and he could immediately sense the disdain emanating from the older man. Judge Harrell had a reputation for being tough, unyielding, and quick to convict. It wasn't just the evidence stacked against him, it was the judge's apparent judgment of him before he'd even said a word. Jerome's gut twisted with the realization that the fight for his innocence might be more uphill than he had ever imagined. But as the judge looked at him with thinly veiled contempt, Jerome made a silent promise to himself: he would not give up. He couldn't. His parents had raised him to stand tall, to face challenges head-on. And now, more than ever, he would need to embody those lessons if he was going to survive this nightmare. The trial had not even begun, but Jerome already felt like he was fighting for his life. Little did he know that this battle would soon take a turn, one that would change everything he thought he knew about justice, the law, and the people who wielded its power. The courtroom nightmare. Jerome's heart thudded in his chest as he stood there, handcuffed, in the middle of the courtroom. The bright, harsh lights overhead seemed to make everything feel cold and clinical. The walls, once thought to be symbols of justice, now felt like the very gates of a prison. The air was thick with tension. His body was shaking, though he was doing his best to hold it together. The sound of whispers from the onlookers mixed with the distant hum of muffled voices. The whole scene felt surreal, like it wasn't happening to him at all. Judge Gregory Harrell didn't even bother to look at Jerome as he entered. Instead, his eyes were fixed on a stack of papers in front of him. Harrell's reputation for being a tough, no-nonsense judge was already well known to everyone in the courtroom, and now, as Jerome stood there, trying to make sense of the situation, it became painfully clear to him that he was facing not just a judge but a man who had made up his mind about Jerome before the trial had even begun. "Mr. Williams," Judge Harrell's voice boomed from the bench. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Jerome barely had time to respond before the judge continued, his voice dripping with disdain. Murder, Mr. Williams. The murder of Evan Richards. Don't tell me you don't understand it, because I've seen your kind before. The kind who think they can play the system, the kind who think they can get away with anything. Well, today, we'll see how much of that confidence you have left. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Jerome stood there, numb, as the judge's gaze bore into him. This wasn't a fair trial, it was a sentence already passed, a punishment delivered before a single shred of evidence had even been discussed. Your Honor, the prosecutor, Linda Hargrove, said, standing tall and sharp in her tailored suit, we have a mountain of evidence that will prove Mr. Williams's guilt. Fingerprints. DNA. A clear motive. And most damning of all, witness testimony placing him at the scene of the crime. Jerome couldn't help but blink. What was she talking about? This was all completely foreign to him. He didn't even know who Evan Richards was, let alone have any motive to harm him. His mind was racing. How had this happened? How was he standing here, being accused of something so monstrous, with no explanation? Objection, Your Honor, shouted Jerome's lawyer, a woman he hadn't yet met but had been assigned to him in a panic-stricken moment by a public defender's office that clearly had its hands full. Her name was Sophia Montgomery, a woman with striking dark hair pulled into a neat, professional bun and piercing green eyes that shone with a calm intensity. This is a baseless accusation. My client is innocent. Judge Harrell waved her off dismissively, not even granting her the courtesy of a response. His eyes never left Jerome. We'll see about that, Ms. Montgomery. We'll see. Jerome's breath hitched in his chest. Every passing second felt heavier, like the walls of the courtroom were closing in on him. Sophia Montgomery, his defense attorney, stood behind him, her eyes scanning the room with calm determination. Jerome could feel her presence, but the weight of Judge Harrell's unblinking stare made him feel small. Out of place. Alone. Sophia had barely spoken, but there was something in the way she held herself, something about the quiet confidence she exuded, that made Jerome feel as if she might be his only ally in this room. He glanced back at her, desperate for some reassurance, but she simply nodded once in his direction. It wasn't a gesture of sympathy, it was a silent promise. She would fight for him, no matter the odds. With a signal from Judge Harrell, the prosecutor, Linda Hargrove, began to speak, detailing the alleged evidence against Jerome. On the night of the murder, Mr. Williams's vehicle was found near the scene. Fingerprints belonging to Mr. Williams were found on the victim's desk. DNA samples were retrieved from the victim's clothing that match Mr. Williams's profile. And, to top it all off, we have an eyewitness who will testify that they saw Mr. Williams leave the victim's office. The more she spoke, the more Jerome's world seemed to tilt. He could barely breathe as the accusations stacked up against him, each word feeling like a hammer striking him harder and harder. His mind screamed in disbelief. This wasn't him. It couldn't be. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding. The evidence couldn't be real. As Linda Hargrove laid out her case with ruthless efficiency, it became painfully clear that this was no ordinary trial. It felt like the game was rigged, and Jerome was already losing. His own lawyer had yet to speak, and even though he wanted to stand up and scream that he was innocent, he could do nothing but sit there, hands still bound by the cold metal of the cuffs. Judge Harrell, who had been silent throughout the prosecution's opening remarks, finally spoke. You've heard the evidence, Ms. Montgomery. What do you have to say in defense of your client? Sophia stood up slowly, her voice firm and clear. Your Honor, the case against Mr. Williams is not as cut and dry as it seems. The evidence presented thus far is circumstantial, at best. Fingerprints found at the scene do not automatically link my client to the crime. DNA samples? They could have been planted or contaminated. As for the witness testimony, well, I will show that this individual's memory is unreliable, clouded by external influences. Judge Harrell didn't even look up from the papers in front of him. "Are you finished, Ms. Montgomery? Your client's fate is already sealed." Jerome felt a sense of despair creeping into his chest. How could this be happening? How could this judge, this man, dismiss his defense so easily without even listening to what Sophia had to say? It was as if Harrell had already made up his mind, and there was nothing that could change it. But Sophia wasn't deterred. She stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the judge. "Your Honor, I ask you to give my client a fair chance. I have only just begun. The truth will come out." The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as Judge Harrell finally raised his eyes from his papers. His gaze met Sophia's, and for the briefest moment, Jerome thought he saw something shift, perhaps a flicker of doubt. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same cold, calculating stare. "Very well," Judge Harrell said, his voice sharp. "We'll continue. But let me make it clear, I don't have patience for delays. If you have any tricks up your sleeve, Ms. Montgomery, I suggest you get to them quickly." Sophia remained unfazed. "I'm not here for tricks, Your Honor. I'm here for justice." Jerome watched in awe as Sophia made her case. Every word she spoke was a carefully crafted response to the prosecution's accusations. Her calm, measured approach was a stark contrast to the mounting tension in the room. She wasn't just defending him, she was fighting to expose the flaws in the entire system. For the first time since the trial began, Jerome felt something stir within him, a sense of hope. Sophia was his lifeline, the only one in the room who believed he could be innocent. The day dragged on, each moment more excruciating than the last. Jerome sat, unable to shake the feeling that this was all slipping away from him. The judge was biased, the prosecutor relentless, and the evidence, though flimsy in his mind, seemed to be enough to turn the jury's opinion against him. Was this really happening? Was his life being torn apart by a crime he hadn't committed? And yet, through all of it, Sophia never wavered. She was like a force of nature, moving through the courtroom with purpose and precision. She knew exactly what to say and when to say it. Jerome began to wonder, could she really pull him out of this? Was there a chance, however slim, that he could walk out of this courtroom a free man? But that would depend on how well she could navigate the shark-infested waters of the courtroom. It wouldn't be easy. Judge Harrell's attitude, combined with the damning evidence the prosecution presented, seemed to ensure that Jerome's path to freedom would be long and fraught with obstacles. As the day drew to a close, Jerome sat back in his chair, exhausted but not broken. Sophia hadn't finished yet. The battle was far from over. The lawyer who changed everything. The days following that first harrowing appearance in the courtroom dragged on, each one a little more surreal than the last. Jerome had never imagined his life would spiral so quickly into chaos, and the weight of the situation pressed down on him relentlessly. He spent those first nights in jail, tossing and turning on the narrow cot, his mind spinning with doubt, fear, and confusion. Each moment seemed to stretch on forever, filled with moments of uncertainty, but also a growing sense of helplessness. Yet, there was one constant that kept him tethered to reality, Sophia Montgomery. From the moment she stepped into the courtroom, there was an undeniable sense of purpose in her every movement. She was everything Jerome wasn't, confident, precise, and seemingly unshaken by the intimidating figures around her. As his lawyer, she hadn't yet cracked the case wide open, but her every action spoke of an unflinching commitment to uncovering the truth. In a system that so often felt rigged, Sophia was the spark that had ignited a small but significant glimmer of hope within him. Sophia wasn't just a lawyer doing her job. It was clear that she was a crusader, fighting not only for Jerome's innocence but for the very principles of justice itself. She wasn't just trying to win a case, she was determined to dismantle the flawed machinery that had wrongfully targeted him. She knew how to play the system, how to turn its limitations into opportunities. The more Jerome watched her work, the more he realized how out of his depth he had been before. He had always believed that the law was black and white, that justice, when fought for, would always prevail. But this case was different. He wasn't merely up against accusations, he was up against an entire system that had already labeled him guilty. That was where Sophia came in. She had met with him several times since his arraignment, but it wasn't until the second week of his trial that Jerome truly began to see how she worked her magic. It wasn't a flashy courtroom trick or an over-the-top dramatic gesture, it was the calm precision with which she dissected everything around her. Sophia had asked Jerome about every detail of his life. They went over his whereabouts the night of the murder in painstaking detail. She made him recall even the smallest interactions he had had in the days leading up to the arrest. It felt almost invasive at times, but she wasn't doing it out of curiosity. She was looking for a crack in the prosecution's story, a mistake, a misstep, something that could undermine the case against him. But it wasn't just the details of the murder investigation that kept Sophia up at night. She was also digging into the people behind the charges. Judge Harrell, she knew, had already shown bias against Jerome. His cold demeanor toward the young man in the courtroom made it clear that Harrell had already formed an opinion. In Sophia's mind, that was an injustice in itself. Judges were supposed to remain impartial, to evaluate the evidence fairly. But from the moment Harrell had seen Jerome, it was as if the gavel had already fallen in his mind. "Don't worry about him," Sophia had told Jerome in one of their late-night strategy meetings. "I'll expose that bias. He's a part of the problem, not the solution." But it wasn't enough to rely solely on Judge Harrell's missteps. Sophia needed to take the fight to the prosecution. Linda Hargrove, the lead prosecutor, was a sharp and seasoned attorney. She was no stranger to playing hardball, and every time she spoke, it was clear she had one goal in mind: conviction. But Sophia didn't fear her. She respected Hargrove's skill, but she knew that truth and strategy were on her side. The first significant breakthrough came when Sophia requested access to the original crime scene reports. The police, who had been the first to respond to the crime scene, had filed their findings in a hasty, almost perfunctory manner. The evidence they had used to accuse Jerome of the murder was based on an assumption that he had been the one to kill Evan Richards. But when Sophia examined the reports, she found discrepancies that the prosecution had conveniently overlooked. The position of the victim's body, the state of the office, even the witness statements, all of it didn't quite add up. In one of the reports, there was an odd notation about a suspicious vehicle parked nearby. The description of the car didn't match Jerome's at all. But, for reasons unknown, the police had decided to focus on Jerome's car simply because it was in the vicinity, dismissing the possibility of other suspects. Sophia immediately latched onto this detail. It was small, but it was significant. She turned her attention to the supposed eyewitness testimony. The prosecution had presented a person who claimed to have seen Jerome near the victim's office, but something about the witness's statement didn't sit right with her. The eyewitness had described Jerome's clothing, but the details were inconsistent with the actual clothing he had been wearing that day. When questioned further, the witness became flustered and couldn't recall basic facts. Sophia saw an opening. This wasn't a solid witness. This was someone who had likely been influenced or coerced into giving false testimony. That was when Sophia realized that the case wasn't just a matter of mistaken identity or bad luck. It was a case of a broken system that had latched onto the first plausible suspect and was too invested in their own narrative to consider the possibility of someone else being guilty. The real killer was out there, and they had been so determined to convict Jerome that they had let the investigation go off track. The more she dug, the more she uncovered. It wasn't just about proving Jerome's innocence, it was about unraveling a web of negligence, incompetence, and corruption. There were larger forces at play here, and Sophia wasn't going to stop until they had all been exposed. But it wasn't only the case against Jerome that kept Sophia up at night. She had seen this kind of thing before. she knew how these cases went. Judges like Harrell weren't just biased, they were often blind to their own prejudices. Sophia had faced more than her fair share of uphill battles, but this one was different. This time, the stakes were personal. If she lost this case, Jerome's life would be destroyed. But if she won, it would be more than just a victory for him. It would be a victory for the very principles that she had built her career on. Her work was exhausting. There were sleepless nights spent poring over documents, analyzing crime scene photographs, and constructing the perfect defense. But slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. She was beginning to see the full picture. It wasn't just about clearing Jerome's name, it was about holding the people who had wronged him accountable. Sophia began to put together a strategy that would turn the tide in Jerome's favor. She would bring in new expert witnesses, ones who would be able to cast doubt on the forensic evidence. She would carefully cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses and expose their inconsistencies. She would show the jury, with absolute clarity, that Jerome had been wrongly accused. But there was one more card to play. A card that no one had anticipated. A revelation that would blow the case wide open. It wasn't just the evidence, it was the truth about the real killer. But Sophia wasn't going to reveal that truth just yet. She was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to make her move. The battle was just beginning, and Sophia Montgomery was ready to fight for Jerome's life. Every step she took, every strategy she devised, was a piece of the larger puzzle she was putting together. And she knew that once everything came together, she would expose the flaws in the system and win this fight, not just for Jerome, but for anyone who had ever been unjustly accused. As the trial continued, the courtroom became her battleground. And with each passing day, she was one step closer to proving Jerome's innocence and dismantling the corrupt system that had tried to bury him. The battle for justice. The next few weeks of the trial felt like an eternity for Jerome. Every day, the stakes seemed to rise higher, the tension more unbearable. As the prosecution continued to press their case, Sophia Montgomery remained unwavering in her defense, her every move calculated, her arguments cutting through the web of deceit that had been spun around Jerome. It was becoming clear to everyone in the room that this wasn't just about proving Jerome's innocence, it was about challenging a corrupt system that had already decided his fate before he even stepped into the courtroom. Sophia's tactics were meticulous. She had already exposed the cracks in the prosecution's case, showing how the evidence they presented was not only circumstantial but in many cases, wholly unreliable. The witness testimony had been inconsistent, the forensic evidence incomplete, and the so-called motive had been based on assumptions rather than facts. Yet, the system had rallied behind the case, as though the mere suggestion of Jerome's guilt was enough to silence all doubts. But Sophia wasn't backing down. She had seen cases like this before, where the system had failed, where biases ran deep, and where the accused had to fight not only against the prosecution but also against the very system that was supposed to protect them. Each day, Sophia fought to expose the flaws in the case. She spent hours poring over every detail, questioning witnesses, cross-examining experts, and presenting evidence that cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. But there was one thing that Sophia knew: the key to winning this case wasn't just about poking holes in the opposition's arguments. It was about forcing the truth into the light, making it undeniable. One of her most brilliant moves came when she called in a forensic expert to testify about the DNA evidence that had been presented by the prosecution. The prosecution had claimed that Jerome's DNA was found on the victim's clothing, which had seemed like a clinching piece of evidence. But Sophia had done her homework. She had consulted with a renowned forensic analyst, Dr. Julia Marks, who was a leading expert in DNA contamination. Dr. Marks testified that the DNA samples collected at the crime scene had been handled improperly, and there was a high probability that the evidence had been contaminated during the process of collection and transport. The room fell silent as Dr. Marks outlined the flaws in the handling of the evidence. She explained how improper storage conditions, the failure to use standard protocols, and the lack of proper documentation had compromised the integrity of the DNA. As she spoke, Sophia glanced at the jury, watching their faces change as they took in the expert's testimony. It was a stunning blow to the prosecution's case. With the DNA evidence in question, Sophia shifted her focus to the fingerprints found at the scene. The prosecution had been quick to claim that Jerome's prints were on the victim's desk, suggesting that he had been the last person to interact with the victim. But Sophia knew better. She had brought in another expert, a fingerprint analyst named Paul Stevens, to testify about the possibility of misidentification. Stevens explained that fingerprints could be left on objects without a person's knowledge, especially in a crowded or chaotic environment. He also presented the possibility that Jerome's prints could have been on the desk for entirely innocent reasons, such as his presence in the office earlier in the week or even his accidental contact with the victim's belongings. The prosecution's case was beginning to crumble. Their reliance on forensic evidence, which they had once presented as airtight, was now in tatters. The expert witnesses that had seemed like strong pillars of their case were being undermined by the defense's experts, whose credentials were indisputable. But it wasn't just the evidence that Sophia had to contend with, it was the psychological pressure of the trial itself. Judge Harrell, whose bias was becoming more apparent with each passing day, seemed to do everything in his power to steer the trial in the prosecution's favor. From cutting off Sophia mid-argument to dismissing key pieces of evidence, Harrell's actions seemed designed to make it harder for the defense to get their message across. But Sophia wasn't intimidated. She knew the law, and she knew how to use it to her advantage. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came when Sophia confronted the judge directly. During one of the many instances where Harrell had interrupted her questioning of a witness, Sophia stood up, her voice calm but resolute. "Your Honor, I request that you allow me to continue with my examination of the witness. The evidence I am presenting is critical to my client's defense, and I will not let this court's bias prevent me from doing my job." Harrell shot her a look of contempt, but Sophia held his gaze without flinching. For the first time in the trial, the judge hesitated. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for him to make his decision. Finally, Harrell, perhaps realizing that his actions were becoming too obvious, reluctantly nodded and allowed Sophia to continue. It was a small victory, but it was one that signified to Jerome that Sophia wasn't just fighting for him, she was fighting for the very principle of justice. The days turned into weeks, and the pressure continued to mount. Jerome spent most of his time sitting quietly at the defense table, feeling both helpless and grateful. He knew that every argument, every piece of evidence, every questioning of a witness brought him one step closer to freedom. But the toll it was taking on him was undeniable. There were moments when he wondered if it was all worth it, if the system would ever truly allow him to escape the shadow of suspicion. But then he would look at Sophia, standing tall, unwavering, and confident, and he knew that as long as she was by his side, there was a chance. It was during one of these long, exhausting days that Sophia made a strategic move that would shift the entire course of the trial. She had been collecting information on the victim's business dealings, trying to uncover anything that might point to another possible suspect. What she found shocked even her. Evan Richards had been involved in several risky financial ventures, one of which was tied to a series of shady deals with Peter Voss, the business partner who had been so quick to offer an alibi during the investigation. Sophia's investigation into Voss had been slow but deliberate, and she was beginning to uncover a pattern of financial irregularities that pointed directly to Voss. He had been embezzling funds from their shared business venture, and Richards had been planning to confront him about it just days before the murder. As Sophia dug deeper, she discovered that Voss had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to commit the crime. His involvement in the financial troubles was undeniable, but more importantly, he had lied about his whereabouts the night of the murder. With this new evidence in hand, Sophia knew she had to act quickly. She immediately contacted her investigator, Rachel, and together they began working to build a case against Voss. They obtained phone records, financial statements, and even surveillance footage from the area near the victim's office on the night of the murder. The evidence was damning. Voss had been in the vicinity at the time of the murder, and the footage showed him leaving the scene shortly after the crime. Sophia knew that this revelation was her final piece of the puzzle. With the truth about Voss's involvement in the murder now in the open, she was ready to make her move. The next day in court, she called a surprise witness to the stand, an accountant who had worked with Voss and had uncovered evidence of the embezzlement. This was the breakthrough she needed. As the accountant detailed the financial discrepancies, the courtroom fell silent. Voss, who had been sitting in the back of the room, his face a mask of calm, suddenly stiffened. His alibi was beginning to unravel, and the walls were closing in on him. The prosecution, who had been so confident of their case, now found themselves scrambling to make sense of the new evidence. It was clear now, Peter Voss was the real killer. The room was filled with a tense anticipation as Sophia turned toward the jury, her eyes steady and full of resolve. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the truth has come to light. My client, Jerome Williams, is innocent. The real murderer is standing before you, hidden in plain sight. It is time for justice to prevail. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Voss, realizing the magnitude of the situation, stood up abruptly, his face pale. He made a move as if to leave, but the bailiffs quickly moved to restrain him. For the first time in weeks, Jerome felt a spark of hope. This nightmare was finally coming to an end. But there was still one final challenge to overcome. The jury had to deliberate, and despite the overwhelming evidence, there was no guarantee they would reach the right conclusion. Jerome sat, tense and exhausted, but Sophia's presence beside him gave him strength. She had fought for him, and now all they could do was wait for the truth to be recognized. As the jury filed back into the room, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jerome held his breath, praying for the justice he knew he deserved.